Hi, and welcome back to another episode of The Next Shift. And I was just thinking recently, is it me or is everything getting a little bit worse? Or at least just a little bit worse than, say, a couple of months ago, and considerably worse than it was a couple of years ago. Take, for example, your favorite streaming service and how it's probably far more expensive than you originally listed it for and is contributing far less value day to day than you had hoped. Or maybe it's customer support teams and how they're way harder to reach and usually do not offer you any sort of useful solutions anymore. Maybe it's trying to order something online and having to scroll past endless amounts of sponsored listings that are completely irrelevant to the initial product that you're looking for, and how the search engines are just not picking up the most basic of terms. Even cancelling a subscription nowadays feels deliberately complicated for no real reason. And perhaps you're also noticing the same thing at work. Your teams are getting smaller, your workload seems to be increasing despite all of this investment in AI and different sort of automation deployments. Maybe it's that promotions feel increasingly out of touch and further away, and every year performance targets seem to rise despite all this economic choppiness. And yes, individually, none of these changes are that dramatic, or at least not nearly as dramatic as I'm making them sound in this video, but collectively they begin to create a bit of a feeling that modern life has just become marginally more frustrating year on year. We're losing control a little bit, and for a long time people really struggled to put that into a certain phrasing. Then in 2022, November 2022, a Canadian journalist coined it, and they coined it as enshittification. Now, I'd be very surprised and equally impressed if anybody watching this video had freely used the term enshittification in their daily life. But within a year of it first being used, it was already selected as a word of the year by certain associations and societies. It was being used by the likes of The Guardian and The Washington Post to describe certain things. And now it's kind of coming into law in some digital circles. And like any other meme, I suppose if a word enters the mainstream this quickly, there must be a really strong reason as for why. So it was a guy called Cory Doctorow, that's the Canadian journalist who originally used this term, and he was trying to explain why digital platforms in particular seem to follow a distinct pattern. His argument was surprisingly simple in this. A platform begins its life as exceptionally good to its users and consumers because it needs to attract them. Think about Google in the early 2000s, or Amazon when it was primarily an online bookshop, Netflix when it was just one subscription which unlocked almost everything, or Uber rides when they were often cheaper than conventional forms of taxis due to enormous venture capital subsidies. And at that stage, growth is more important than anything, more important than profit. Investors are willing to lose billions of dollars just to gain this market share. But then something changes. You and I are bought in. We're now dependent on some of these platforms. And that's when attention shifts to business customers, or at least potential business customers. So think about advertising, that increases. Sponsored listings begin appearing. Algorithms become less concerned with giving you the best result and more concerned with giving somebody else the result that they've then paid for. And then finally, to complete this pattern, according to Doctorow, the platform reaches a point where both users and businesses now become secondary to shareholders. Prices increase, fees increase, customer support shrinks, features disappear behind paywalls that were previously free. The goal is no longer to create any more value, it's to extract as much value as possible from people who no longer have any other alternatives. Now I'm just going to look down at my laptop and quote Doctorow one for one on his brilliant summary of all of this. First, they are good to their users. Then they abuse their users to make things better for their business customers. Then they abuse those business customers to claw back all the value for themselves. Whether you agree with this argument isn't really the point, because I'm going to show you some examples that you will immediately recognize. So let's take the biggest fish of them all and take Amazon as our first example. And for years, their search function was largely effortless for us to use as consumers. But consumer groups today and other researchers involved in this space have repeatedly criticized the growing dominance of sponsored listings, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish advertisements from organic recommendations. Independent sellers have complained for years about this, about rising marketplace fees, whilst regulators in both Europe and the United States have investigated whether Amazon unfairly advantages its own products over those of third-party suppliers. And Google obviously tells a similar story. For years, and certainly growing up, "just Google it" was a phrase used by many to find reliable information online. Today, entire communities exist around the idea that Google search simply isn't as useful as it once was. The phrase Reddit was used so routinely on the end of Google search queries that Google struck a licensing agreement worth tens of millions of dollars to access Reddit's content for AI training, while simultaneously relying on Reddit discussions to improve the usefulness of search results. when users start deliberately bypassing your search engine to find better answers elsewhere, something fundamental has changed. Netflix provide a really interesting example of enshittification because in 2011, the average UK household would spend £6 per month on their Netflix subscription, and they'd have however many people use it, and they'd have a massive catalogue, and we became dependent on it. But since then, prices have repeatedly risen, password sharing has become completely restricted, advertising supported tiers have become pretty much compulsory. They were introduced, and much of the catalogue has become incredibly fragmented, with 101 new streaming services offering very particular things and launching their competing services. None of these decisions at any time were necessarily irrational, and every single one made commercial sense, but collectively they changed the relationship between us as the customer and the company, and obviously the product has got way worse. Sticking with the digital platform theme here, I suppose the most divisive example of all of this will be Twitter. In 2022, a whole World Cup cycle ago, Elon Musk acquired Twitter and reduced its workforce by around 80%. Trust and safety teams in particular were heavily affected during this time. Customer support was also scaled back, and many advertisers, because of some of this and obviously many other reasons, paused spending amid concerns over moderation. Users reported heavy increases in spam, impersonation, and technical instability. And whether you believe the platform ultimately improved or deteriorated, few would argue that it remained the same. As not to be so doom and gloom about all of this, I will label and showcase some genuine strides forward that certain governments and joint communities have made in order to combat some of this enshittification, this sort of behaviour. The European Digital Markets Act in particular, which was forced through in 2023, represented the biggest overhaul of digital competition laws in my lifetime, which is still a relatively new thing, I suppose, so it's kind of the first of its kind. It targeted so-called gatekeeper-style platforms and companies, and these were companies that were considered so dominant that they can shape markets almost unilaterally. Since then, the likes of Apple, Meta, Google have all faced investigations which have been very publicised, or enforcement action under this legislation. And although this law doesn't necessarily use the word enshittification, it is effectively trying to prevent exactly the behaviours Doctorow described, which were platforms using their dominance to preference their own services, lock users into ecosystems, and reduce competition, which is quite a remarkable journey for an idea that started as a blog post. The more I think about enshittification, the less I'm convinced that it's just about technology. I think it's a story all about incentives. And once you begin looking at incentives instead of apps or subscription services, you start seeing the exact same problem happening elsewhere. For example, the workplace. One of the defining features of capitalist organizations has been the relentless pursuit of efficiency. In principle, that's obviously very sensible. Businesses should become, or should aim to become, far more productive. Technology should remove a lot of repetitive, busy work. Artificial intelligence should allow people to spend more time on tasks that genuinely require that human judgment. But that isn't always what happens. Instead, many organizations have interpreted efficiency as doing the same amount of work just with fewer people. And it's clear to see over the last 2 decades that management structures have become far flatter. A lot of middle management has been removed because of this. Teams have either gotten so small that they've become so accountable and so overworked that, average tenures are dropping off a cliff, or they've continued to grow in the usual sort of trajectory, but single managers, single points of failures have become far more responsible for far many more direct reports than they ever have done before. And there's been plenty of recruitment freezes during this time, which have become commonplace in the market, even in profitable businesses. And when employees leave, vacancies often remain unfilled whilst the work is quietly redistributed among those who remain. And if you've been part of a larger organisation recently, especially in the UK in the last 6 to 12 months, you would have noticed 2 things. The target rarely falls, the headcount often does. Gallup's global workforce research consistently found that only 1 in 5 employees are actively engaged in the workplace, whilst workplace stress remains at a record high. Microsoft's Work Trend Index also reported that knowledge workers in particular are interrupted by meetings, emails, or messages every couple of minutes throughout their working day, creating what it calls an infinite workday, in which boundaries between productive work and administrative noise have almost disappeared. I think everyone will be feeling that right now. And this is where I think employment begins to resemble Doctorow's model. As somebody who owns a recruitment firm called Meritus Talent, I can say the following with my chest, because at first organizations compete aggressively aggressively for talent. They invest in training, in development and culture because attracting skilled people matters. Then conditions change. Growth slows inevitably, organically. Interest rates rise. Shareholders demand higher returns. The language remains the same from the outset. Our people are our family, our people are our greatest asset, but the incentives begin shifting elsewhere. Training budgets will then shrink, promotion slows, performance targets increase, the work itself becomes progressively harder, not because the job has become more important, but because there are fewer people left to do it. One of the most overlooked consequences of this is obviously promotion, because 30 years ago, many large organizations had very clean and clear-cut management ladders. There were supervisors, assistant managers, senior managers, regional managers and directors, and every restructuring removed a little bit of that hierarchy in the name of productivity. And on paper, flatter organizations look way more efficient, and in likelihood, a lot of them are, but in reality, they also remove opportunities to progress, which is why tenures have fallen off a cliff and why people are speeding for counter offers and counter opportunities elsewhere at competitors to move up rather than staying loyal to their organizations. Promotion no longer seems to depend solely on performance. It increasingly depends on somebody above you leaving, and you can exceed every target your employer sets and still find nowhere to go because the rung that you were aiming for just simply doesn't exist anymore. And no, I don't think businesses deliberately go out there to create this outcome, just as Amazon back in the day didn't deliberately ask how shopping can become more frustrating. Most employers don't begin by asking how exhausting their work could get. The problem is more cumulative than that. It's one recruitment freeze, one restructuring, one additional KPI, one fewer manager, one postponed promotion. Individually, each decision makes a lot of financial sense. Collectively, they create an organization that employees simply aren't responding to. And perhaps that's why I find enshittification such a powerful word, because it describes hundreds, if not thousands, of perfectly rational decisions that over time quietly make everything a little bit worse. And maybe that's the real lesson here, is that enshittification is not a technology problem, it's not a business problem, and like I said, it's an incentive problem. Whenever success is measured almost exclusively by quarterly returns rather than long-term value, the temptation to extract becomes greater than the incentive to improve. Customers notice, employees will notice, and eventually investors will notice too. And the question isn't whether enshittification exists. The evidence suggests that. In many industries it already does, as I've already labelled. The more interesting question here is whether we've become so accustomed to gradual decline that we started accepting it as the new normal. Because with the exception of huge, catastrophic global financial collapses, history tells us that businesses don't just fail overnight. They become fractionally worse quarter after quarter until one day people don't even recognize them anymore. And by then, the damage is much harder to reverse than anyone expected. And so I'd love to hear from you in the comment section down below on different platforms or products or services that you originally signed up for, became dependent on, and have noticed them getting gradually worse to the point that you're either going to remove yourselves from them or you're stuck in a service that you just can't get rid of because you become too dependent on it. And subscribe for more. The majority of this channel is based around employment, but taking economic news and ideas and sociology and comparing that to what affects our everyday working lives. This has been The Next Shift, and I'll see you on the next one.